This video covers the release notes for Lore version 0.9. This release contains a couple foundational improvements. The first is that the hooks are now extensible, which allow you to override Lore's built-in behaviors or extend the framework with your own. And the second foundational change is that the reducers are now composable, which makes it easy to override the default reducers or add your own reducers alongside the defaults. This release also includes support for 3 additional features. The first is a set of convention-generated dialogues designed to provide a visual interface to help with early-stage data creation. The second is a formal support for authentication and authorization, so you can log users in and toggle what they see based on user permissions. And the third feature callout is beta support for WebSockets, with examples demonstrating usage using Socket.io, sales, and the action cable implementation in Rails 5. So let's dive in to discuss these changes, starting with the foundational improvements. Now, to understand why the ability to override and extend hooks is important, it helps to explain something about Lore that may not be obvious. And that is that while Lore does contain a decent amount of built-in functionality, the core of the framework is actually a little more than a plugin loader tailored towards client-side web development. The functionality you see in Lore is implemented as a series of plugins called hooks that are loaded by default. For example, there is an actions hook that creates all of the default actions from models, merges in custom user actions, and binds all of them to the dispatch method in the Redux store. There's another hook that creates the default reducers provided for each model, a connect hook that creates the connect decorator that is responsible for providing data or invoking actions to fetch that data if it doesn't exist, and another hook that composes the final Redux store and provides it with a previously mentioned set of reducers. And there are also some hooks that are not listed that are responsible for creating the models and collections used for AJAX communication. So what happens when you call lore.summon in the index.js file at the root of your application is that the Lore core automatically loads up and executes all of these default hooks. With the change made in this release, you can now also provide your own hooks to Lore so that you can extend the built-in functionality or so that you can override one of the built-in hooks if you want to change the default behavior. And 2 of the features we'll be talking about later, Dialogs and WebSockets, are implemented in just this manner, as optional hooks you can install and integrate into Lore if you want that functionality. The second foundational change in Lore is the ability to compose reducers, and this is something I'm personally very excited about. If you recall, when you create a model in Lore, the framework implicitly provides a set of actions and reducers that support standard CRUD operations. So let's focus on those. Now, if you wanted to override the default create action, you simply create your own action under action/post/create. And once you do, Lore will notice that you provided your own create action for the post, and it will use that one instead of the default. With this release, the same is now true for reducers. So, for example, you wanted to override the default find reducer responsible for keeping track of query and pagination results. To do that, you simply define a reducer called find under reducer/post/find, and Lore will use that reducer instead of the default. Similar to actions, if you create a reducer with a name that does not match a blueprint, such as this custom reducer, the framework will now add that reducer to the set provided by default. If you want to completely take control of all reducers for a model, you have 2 options. The first is that you can create a reducer matching the name of the model, such as post in this example, and place it at the root of the reducers folder. This will declare to Lore that you want to manage all post reducers yourself, and the framework will provide nothing for that model. As an alternate syntax, you can accomplish the same thing by providing a reducer called index inside a folder named after the model. So that concludes the overview regarding the foundational improvements. So let's talk about the new features, starting with auto-generated dialogues. There are many applications that use dialogues for handling experiences like creating, updating, and deleting data. But dialogues also have a large amount of boilerplate that can sometimes require only small code changes between experiences like create and update, and even between different resources. Now, the dialogues shown here are all pretty simple, and if we were building this application for real, we'd want to customize each one to provide a better user experience or remove the dialogues altogether and replace them with inline editing. But early in application development, we often just need a way to create or edit data as we're laying out the code for the overall user experience, and dialogues can be a good way to do that. So this feature is about providing dialogues for models without the need to explicitly create them with the following caveats. The first is that these dialogues are only intended as a bootstrapping tool, not as a final implementation. And the second is that they are intended to be replaced or overwritten as an application evolves. So with that said, there are 2 versions included in this release, one hook for generating dialogues using Bootstrap and one for generating dialogues using Material UI. So let's talk about the configuration and setup, and then I'll demonstrate. Before you can use any of these dialogs, you first need to install the hook matching whatever UI library your application is using. In this example, we're using Bootstrap, so we'll install lorehook dialogs bootstrap, and then we need to register the hook in the index.js file at the root of your project. Next, you'll need to go into any models you want to generate dialogs for and include some information about their attributes. At a minimum, you need to provide the data type, and there are also optional fields like display name and placeholder text. With those two steps complete, the dialogs will be available for use. So now we just need to invoke them. For that, you'll need to go into your component and find whatever callback will be used to launch the dialog. Then you need to call lore.dialog.launch, which is a hook responsible for mounting and unmounting dialogs and making sure they have access to the router and the Redux store. Next, you'll need to provide that function with the dialog you want to launch. For this example, we want to create a to-do, so we'll call lore.dialogs.todo.create. These are the dialogs provided by this hook. Each dialog takes a callback, which is where it will pass any information provided by the user if they submit the data. Once that data is provided, we can then pass it directly to the create action, which will make a server call to create our to-do. So let's demonstrate. So this example is a simple to-do list. So we'll create our first to-do, and we'll say that we are going to demonstrate the dialogs hook. And we're going to record a video demonstrating the hook in action. Our task is not complete yet, and we're going to give it a priority of 3. So we'll create that task. We can also click the edit button. If we wanted to mark it as complete, we can update it. And our task is crossed out as complete, and we can also delete the task, and it will go away. To get this example to work in the index.js file at the root of the directory, we first had to install the lorehook dialogs bootstrap hook and register it through lore.summon. Next, if we open the model, you can see that there are 4 attributes: title, description, is completed, and priority, of type string, text, boolean, and number, along with some of the visual modifications to make the dialogs a little easier to use. Next, if we head over to the header, we have our button with an onClick method, and from there we call lore.dialog.show. We provide the dialog here being the to-do create dialog, and our callback of create to-do, which receives parameters, and then we fire our action. For the update, it works very similar, except that we need to provide one more parameter, which is the model that we're going to be updating, and this is what allows it to pre-populate the fields in the dialog with the existing information. The next feature introduced in this release is formal support for authentication and authorization. This is the scenario where a user loads your application, but you don't know who they are, so you want to present them with a login experience. Then once they log in, the application is loaded in whatever state reflects their user permissions, and visual elements are shown or hidden based on what the user is allowed to do. Let's start by talking about the authentication part. To help with authentication, this release includes a new package called LoreAuth, and this package contains a set of generators for making higher-order components to help with authentication and authorization concerns. To integrate authentication, we're going to create a higher-order component using the authentication generator, and we're going to name this higher-order component user_is_authenticated. The idea with this decorator is that we'll use it to wrap our application, and if the user is not authenticated, we'll redirect them to the login page. The redirect URL is located at /login by default, but you can change it. When the user is redirected, the URL they were trying to go to is saved as a query parameter called redirect, which you can also change if you'd like. Finally, we need to provide an implementation for the isAuthenticated method to determine whether the user is logged in. For this example, we're simply going to be looking for a user token in local storage, but you also have access to the Redux store if you need it for whatever approach you're using. To prevent unauthenticated access to your application, simply go into your routes file and wrap your application with the user_is_authenticated component you just created. Authorization works similarly, but has a different purpose. Here we can see 2 different users logged in. On the top, we have a user with administrative permissions who can create, edit, delete, and view to-dos. On the bottom, we have a user with fewer permissions who can only edit and view to-dos. We can also see that the visual interface is modified to hide features the user does not have permission to use, such as the create and delete buttons. To control whether a component is displayed, you once again pull in the generators from LoreAuth, but this time we're going to use the authorization generator. We're going to call the higher order component we're creating user_can_create_to_do. Then we need to implement the isAuthOrized method to determine whether the user has the appropriate permissions. For this example, we're going to pull the user permissions out of the Redux store and then check to see if they have the create permission. Once this higher order component is created, we use it by importing it into the component we want to control access to and wrapping that component. So let's look at a demonstration of authentication and authorization in action. So here we are looking at the auth example. So if I reload this page, you can see that we were trying to access the root of the application, but we aren't authenticated. So it redirected us to login and provided a redirect query parameter with the root as the reference. So I'm going to start by logging in as the normal user account. And when I log in, you can see that I have two permissions over here on the left. I have permission to retrieve to-dos and to edit to-dos. But there's a message here that says I need to log in as the admin if I want to create tasks. So we're going to log out. I'm going to log back in as the administrative user. And now I can see that I have two more permissions. I can create to-dos, and I'm also allowed to delete to-dos. So let's create our first to-do, and we'll say demonstrate auth, and I'm going to create the task, and I can delete the task if I wanted to. And we're going to log back out, log in one more time as the user, and now you can see that I can see the task, and I can edit the task. I can mark it as complete if I wanted, but I can't delete the task. So that is the auth example. The core of this example is in source decorators auth, and you can see a list of decorators that were created, and the one we're going to start with is user is authenticated. So here you can see we pulled in the lore auth package, and we're accessing the authentication generator, and we've created a generator, and we have a package here for auth is logged in, and this package, if I navigate to it, is just checking to see if there's a user token in local storage. If we navigate to our routes, we are pulling in that decorator here, and we are wrapping our application's master component with user is authenticated. And that is what controls the behavior if we try to access the application and we don't have a token in local storage. We're redirected to /login. Next, we'll take a look at one of the authorization generators. So we have a component here called create to do button. And this is one of the components that if we're an administrative user, we can see it. And if we are a user without create to do permissions, we cannot see it. So everything about this component is created like you normally would, except that it is wrapped with this user can create to do. So we'll jump over to that definition and take a look at it. So here we're pulling in the authorization generator, and our is authorized method right here. We are getting the current user permissions from the Redux store, and then we're looking through each of those permissions to see if any of them match the type to do create. If they do, this is true, and if not, this is false. If is authorized evaluates to true, the create to do button will be rendered as we've created it. If it evaluates to false, this component will not render anything. The last new feature included in this release is beta support for WebSockets, also known as real-time communication. This is a feature that is very important to me, as I think it's critical to maintaining a positive user experience for applications that have multiple users viewing the same data, though it's in a beta stage right now, as there are still a few changes I want to make in the next release. But for now, let's take a look at the example and talk a little about how it works. Here we're looking at the WebSockets example, and I have two browser tabs open to simulate two different users. So on the left, I'm going to create a task, and I'm going to say demonstrate WebSockets example. And I'm going to say record a video. And I'm going to create that. And it shows up on the other browser tab automatically. So over here, I'm going to go and I'm going to edit that. And I'm going to just delete that and check the box and give it a priority. And I'll update it, and it updates it on the other browser tab. And if I delete it over here, it deletes it in both browsers. To integrate WebSockets into your application, you'll first need to install the version of the WebSockets hook that corresponds to your backend server. So at the time of this recording, there are implementations against sales, a sort of vanilla Socket.io implementation using Express, and the Action Cable implementation that's new in Rails 5. There were 3 implementations created during this release because I was looking for a common pattern that I could extract out and use across multiple sort of diverse implementations. Once you install the hook, you'll then need to go into your config directory and create a WebSockets config file. And you'll need to specify the server URL, which is the root URL of your WebSockets server. Now, like most of the things in Lore, there are some conventions that are assumed in order to provide some amount of functionality without you having to explicitly configure it. So if we navigate down to Source Components and we open Master, there are two methods added here on component did mount and component will unmount. If your backend server follows the sort of conventions that this hook assumes, the only things you need to do to integrate WebSocket support is call lore.websockets.todo.create, and this will connect to the WebSocket server that To-Do is responsible for, or that provides to-dos rather, and then you will need to subscribe to the to-do events. On unmount, if you want to stop listening, then you can unsubscribe to events. So this configuration would be for if you wanted to listen for sort of all events for that model across the entire application. So let's flip over to the browser and look at the network request. So when the server emits data for a WebSocket event, we can look at that, and if we click on frames, we can see that there's an example kind of event emitted here. And this is what the server sent across. So this first part is the event name. So it's saying we're emitting something related to a to-do. And then the package the server emits has a verb field, which tells us that it was a to-do that was created. And there's a data field that contains data about that to-do that was created. So if your server emits events following that convention, then you don't need to do anything. You can just sort of make these calls and data will start showing up in your application. If your server doesn't follow that convention, then you need to go back into your WebSockets config and you have a couple options. The first is that you can fill out this parse method. So you could uncomment that and you could take whatever message the server does get and you could transform it into the format that the hook uses by default. That would be if you wanted to take advantage of the dispatchers or the dispatching approach that the hook uses. Alternately, you could implement the dispatch method, and this will allow you to take full control over how the events are sort of distributed between the dispatchers that exist. So the last thing to mention for WebSockets is that it basically implements a set of actions. If data is created, updated, or deleted, there's a sort of underlying dispatcher blueprint that knows how to take that event and convert it into an action that's emitted to the Redux store. So in a lot of ways, it just piggybacks on top of the existing action infrastructure. So if you'd like to find out more about WebSockets, I'll be enhancing the README and the example over the course of this next release cycle. That covers all of the changes in this release. The next release will focus on improving support for WebSockets, as well as externalizing all of the hooks currently in Lore Core and formalizing them as NPM packages. As we mentioned previously, the majority of functionality in Lore is implemented as a series of plugins called hooks, most of which are loaded implicitly when Lore builds the application. This change will pull all of these hooks out of Lore Core and convert them into NPM packages that will need to be required explicitly. The reason for doing this is to formalize the plugin nature of the framework in order to make it more obvious how Lore works and what functionality can be overridden. Finally, the next release will also include a new command called extract, designed to make it easier to override and extend the functionality the framework provides by default. Here's the use case for extract. Let's say you wanted to override the default create action for a post. Currently, you'd need to create a new action from scratch or dig into the framework code to copy out the create blueprint and then modify it for use with the post model. The extract command is designed to do that for you. Running lore extract action post/create, for example, will insert a create action that mirrors the behavior of the blueprint but is customized to work explicitly with the model you specify. There will also be a version of this command for extracting the reducers. The upcoming v0.10 release will also mark the completion of all of the features and functionality I originally wanted to include in Lore, which means after that my focus will shift towards updating the website documentation and recording a new set of tutorials for beginning, intermediate, and advanced development concerns. So with that, take care and thanks for watching.